Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Staffing Innovations Committee meeting, February 6, 2020 at 12 o'clock. I'm going to go through some slides, hopefully to inspire you and to get you thinking about the complexity of the task of staffing. When I first started to look at the literature regarding staffing and acuity tools, it was pretty exciting because there's a lot out there. It's definitely a hot topic. For example, the American Nurse Association published its third edition of Principles for Nurse Staffing this past fall, September of 2019. The National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization introduced an acuity tool called the Hospice Patient Family Acuity Tool this past July 2019. And in addition, the ANA is working with federal officials to compel the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare to provide Congress with information about how agencies assess adequate staffing. And this is going to be part of their 2020 budget requests. So it's an opportunistic time for us to even talk about this, and we're kind of ahead of the game here. So the other part I would like to tell everybody is that while most of the literature surrounds nurse staffing, what we're really talking about is staffing of the whole IDT. And that is something that differentiates most acuity tools, because they're really focused on the number of nurses that should be on a particular unit. And this is kind of mandated by government laws, by the Nursing Association recommendations, and also compliance standards that we have. There isn't anything really like that for spiritual support, for secretaries, for providers. But the information that we find in the nurse literature can be translated to any discipline that we have inside of hospice. So what do we know? We definitely know that no two healthcare settings are the same, and no single healthcare setting is the same from hour to hour. We know that successful staffing is a collaboration of all disciplines. We know that the inpatient hospice care environment is very unique. We know that hospice care expands beyond the patient and cares for their family as well. And we also know that we are evolving. We are expanding our skills, our service, and our talents. So what does the research say about staffing? So staffing and scheduling have an impact on clinical outcomes, patient satisfaction, staff engagement, and financial and compliance outcomes. Now, what is acuity? You know, it seems rational that patient acuity affects patient care. But the more important question is why and how? So I decided that my definition of acuity was the time and effort to care holistically for a patient. And using that logic, that the higher the patient acuity, the more resources are needed to provide safe care and maintain good outcomes. And when we look at those three things, patient acuity, resources, and outcomes, there's an interrelationship there, because as acuity rises, resource needs therefore will rise, and therefore outcomes becomes more almost affected by this rise and change. And then those outcomes, depending on what those outcomes are, is ultimately going to affect the acuity again and the resources. So it keeps going round and round and round. So what are these resources? Well, it's equipment, supplies. It's also team dynamics. And this is interesting, and you've all experienced it. So I remember as a very new nurse working in the ICU at night, I knew when I came on the floor, if there were certain people that were working there, no problem. It didn't matter what happened. It didn't matter how many codes there were, or RRTs, or if we were down, 3-patient assignment instead of 2-patient assignment, it didn't matter, because the team dynamics that were there could handle any shift in acuity, could handle any unexpected event that happens. Contrastingly, if those key people or key resources were not there, let's say a unit secretary or the PCT, or sometimes we would have ancillary support there, like spiritual support sometimes showed up at night. So when those things weren't there, it was a different night. It was a different energy. So those team dynamics are competence. It's the ability to collaborate, so collaboration, the role that they bring, and the responsibilities that they bring to that team. Then there's that access to the interdisciplinary team that's a factor. And finally, your personal energy and mood. I also knew when I was a young nurse that how I felt when I walked onto that unit probably affected how my night was going to go by about 80%. Because if I came in with a positive attitude, if I slept, if I had a good meal, if nothing was happening at home, my kids were okay, they weren't sick, when I was walking in with that can-do attitude, it could change the whole entire 12 hours. So what are outcomes? So here at Samaritan, we provide the Samaritan difference. So that's probably one of our main goals here. And the outcome is we want to provide this. Often we've talked about, I can't provide the Samaritan difference. We are not succeeding in providing the Samaritan difference. These things are exceeding expectations, create wows, see through the lens of the customer, never let backstage on stage. Everything speaks. Focus on relationships and not just tasks. But how do we measure that? How do we know that we are providing the Samaritan difference, and how do we know that we aren't, so that we can use that information to figure out what barriers we're experiencing so that we can change those resources, change the way that we're looking at staffing so that we can achieve those outcomes. In hospice, our goal is to relieve suffering. We are measuring that to a certain degree in our 12-hour outcomes and in our care planning. So we identify an area that we'd like to work on to relieve suffering, and then we put interventions to achieve that goal, and then we assess how well we did that, and if we didn't make it, we change our interventions. Also, hospice is empowering others. Our most important thing is that we are here to deliver something different than what people have before. So they're coming to us from a hospital, well, there's nothing left for them. Or we're giving them a death experience that just doesn't exist without the resources and the help that we can provide. We are measuring that by using the patient and family goals. So we're asking them, what could this be like for you? What can we do for you? How can we serve you? So we're empowering them to define what this journey is going to be like, and we help make that happen. So the two important questions that I have is, what factors need to be considered when making daily staffing decisions? Is it numbers? Is it how many wings? Is it because there's admissions and discharges? Is it event patient? You know, what are those factors? And then the second question is, what factors are within our control that affect acuity, resources, and outcomes? So those are the questions that go to those team dynamics, to our individual competencies, to our collaboration, to our energy, to our mood, to our roles and responsibilities. There's a different word that I saw out there when I was doing the literature, and it's called intensity. So when we think about acuity, we're thinking about patient acuity, right? But it's more about intensity. It's more about how much energy that am I going to need to give to accomplish those goals, to get those great outcomes. So it's not just acuity, but it's like this intensity, this what is it we're going to require of me and the team? So when we look at intensity, it includes patient complexity, so that's your traditional acuity. It also considers total department workload. So that's when you look at the whole unit and you look at what's going on with the unit. This could be things that are outside the patient complexity. It could be the fact that maybe the linens are out, or perhaps there's a conference going on and there's no parking, or there's different things that affect the workings of the unit. Then there's this thing called census disparity. And census disparity is this lack of similarity or equality. It's different. So our census rises and falls. There's no predicting what our census is going to be. So that's something that's different. So you can't necessarily understand census by looking at numbers because of this disparity that goes on. And then you can't compare yourself with others because the census disparity is there. The fourth thing is called patient churn. And I love this word, the patient churn. So obviously that is the in and out of our patients, right? So it's the intensity of an admission and the intensity of a pronouncement. And sometimes those two events happen really close together. When you look at the budget and financial concerns with staffing and with being responsible for that type of very high resource, our length of stay is 4.9 days. So when we look at our census and we look at our patient days, when our patients are coming in and maybe their length of stay is 1 day, that's a significant patient churn because we are losing revenue on that patient. Of course, we don't think of it that way. We're just caring for patients, but it's something to think about in the overall picture of how we think about staffing, because that churning, that the faster the churn happens, it affects us financially. So it's something, just another thing to think about. And then finally, there's this this experience called compression complexity. And many of you felt this when we took our first vent patient. And what they defined this as is what caregivers experience when they're expected to assume additional, unplanned responsibilities while also performing their regular duties in a condensed time frame. Makes sense, right? So that's something else. So it really is more than how much is my patient going to need? Are they on drips and wounds? It really is a huge, gigantic overview picture of what it takes to appropriately staff a unit. So I don't have a picture of our staffing, our current acuity tool here, but you all have it. But what we're measuring right now for acuity is geography. We're asking, okay, how many wings are open? We're asking about the shift. Is it day shift? Is it night shift? Are support staff available? Is there food service in Voorhees? Do we have secretaries? Is there going to be a manager and a doctor? So, what's going on with the support staff? And then we look at patient acuity. We look at the falls, agitation, suicidal. We look at, do we have new admissions coming in? Do we have patients on isolation? What's going on with the family? Is there some high emotional acuity going on? What are the physical attributes of that patient? Do they require 2 people to turn them, 3 people to turn them? Are they a max assist getting out of bed and they want to get out of bed every day? Also the complexity, frequency of treatments, wound care, suctioning, things like that. And finally, that PPS of 10, which goes along with the new admission. So you've got that intensity of the beginning and the intensity of the end. And what we've been doing is just giving a point for everything that's a yes. Don't necessarily think that's the appropriate way to go. What we've gotten is a range from 6 to 44 as far as acuity goes. So I think we can fine tune what we're measuring. And the next step would be, do we measure this per patient, not per staff, per shift? Do we measure it every single patient and then figure out what is the acuity of that particular patient? And is that a different way of measuring it? This is a peek at the hospice acuity assessment tool that I talked about at the beginning. Now, this acuity assessment tool is intended to appraise the frequency and intensity, the scope of practice provided by the whole hospice interdisciplinary team. So it looks at things a little bit differently, and it's not just focused on nursing care. The goal for us is to facilitate effective functioning of the IDT and to promote comfort and optimal outcomes for patients and families. So the tool acuity rates are based on the amount of interdisciplinary team time and effort required to provide care, including time required for the initial interventions that we start up, like starting an infusion, and then the follow-up, the frequency of contacts and interventions, the emotional and physical energy expenditures that would be required, and the expertise or skill required to provide these things. It also puts it on a range that it's like a mild, moderate, severe range that, again, anybody who's walking in that door can easily change that acuity assessment based on what they're finding. So it's an evolving tool. It's not stuck to numbers. It's kind of more of a felt acuity tool that's more encompassing of the whole entire team. This picture right here is from the ANA's nurse staffing guidelines, and it also tries to get you to look outside of just patient acuity. So here we look at the consumer, and that's our patient. So that would be, again, the traditional acuity that we look at for patients, how much time and effort to care for that patient. Number 2 is interprofessional teams. So that's looking at the individual actions and collaboration within the team members that are working that day, and that everybody's a full partner in the delivery of that care. So one person's not doing more care than another person. It's very even and it's very collaborative. Then we look at the workplace culture. So the team must be able to create a workplace that promotes creativity, that promotes positivity, that's a can-do workplace. And it also needs to be a safe workplace, and you need to have the things that you need to have. And that kind of goes into the practice environment. So here's where we look at all the resources that we need, the computer system, the EMR, the drugs available. So all of these things work together to influence any given shift. And then last is the evaluation. And this is creating well-developed staffing guidelines with measurable care-sensitive outcomes. And when we have something to measure to make sure that we are staffing correctly, it informs everything that we do. So it kind of completes that picture. These are some words of wisdom by 6 different leaders in healthcare organizations and they're kind of 2 cents on what to do with staffing and scheduling. The first is from Debbie Hatmaker. She's a CNO at ANA Enterprises. She says that we need to move from volume to value of care provided, along with change that will likely impact where and when we provide care. So she's talking about, the patient-centered idea rather than the census-based idea, and also that care environments and the whole gamut of healthcare is changing. So we have to evolve with that, and we have to think about the value of what we're providing rather than the amount of what we're providing. She also talks about the creativity and problem solving by the entire team. So no one person can do this alone, and you don't want that because you lose. That's kind of like a tunnel vision. You want the perspective of everyone so that you're thinking globally, you're thinking bigger, the bigger picture. She says, first, we need to creatively problem solve to address staffing issues. This means following the evidence regarding staffing, patient outcomes, job satisfaction, as well as continuing to test new models of care and processes with ongoing input from the direct care staff. Viewing staffing as an instrument and not merely an operational expense is a major grand scale shift in how we think about delivering patient care. So that was from Christina Schulman. She was the past president of AACN. That goes back to that value that Debbie was talking about. So our resources, our staff, each other, you and I, are an investment. So it changes how we look at it. We are an investment that Samaritan is providing to these patients and these families. So it kind of shifts it from looking at staffing as the greatest expenditure of a organization. We're the greatest investment that the organization has. So that kind of changes everything of how you look at what we're doing. She also says that organizations must embrace innovation to design and systematically test staffing models. Again, we need think about this differently. Lisa Ricks she's the past president of AACN, and she talks a lot about shared governance. So if we are going to have this broader perspective, and if we're going to be thinking outside the box, and we're changing the way we're thinking, then we got to get together and talk about it. And it has to be the people that are doing the care, not necessarily the leaders of the organization. So this is where this shared governance comes from, and it requires giving staff time away from direct patient care so that they can identify opportunities for improvement and create solutions to their challenges. Imagine the solutions that we could come up with together, because you know how best it is to work. So you got to bring that information forward. The other one is Mary Beth Kingston. She was the president and CNO of Advocate Aurora Health. She talks about technology like the EMR. So our EMR must enhance workflow. It should have predictive census and acuity and staff information in it. So for example, if we are doing a Braden scale and a Fall scale, and maybe we have a diagnosis of dementia and a symptom of agitation, the EMR is going to be smart enough to start assigning acuity to those factors that we're entering into the computer. So it takes it a step away from our critical thinking, looking at a patient and saying, oh, this is high acuity. It really gives us a place to measure, and the system is doing it automatically for us. She also talks about work-life balance, which is huge. So this is the stuff where you're responsible for yourself, and you're responsible for that energy that you're going to be bringing to the shift. So take care of yourself, eat, spend time with your family, whatever that is, so that your body, you come in with a full, your full self, not half of yourself. That's that never let backstage come on stage. And then the healthy work environment. We're talking a lot about team building and a lot about how we treat each other in that environment and take care of each other in that environment. And it's each and every one of us responsibility to make sure that our working environment is healthy. Margaret Gavigan, she's the System VP for Clinical Operations at Advocare Aurora Health. She talks about this thing called flexible workforce. And for us, it's kind of like cross-training. So, but what she's talking about is that across an organization, it should be standardized. So if there's an RN working for the organization, that RN can work in any part of that organization. And what it does is it allows you more flexibility with those resources. So if census is fluctuating to the field, or fluctuating to palliative care referrals, or fluctuating to the inpatient unit, you have the resources that are able to fluctuate into those different areas. So it's, again, a different way of thinking about what we're doing, and not working in these silos at Samaritan, but really thinking about how each of our disciplines provide care. And who knows, maybe our disciplines even work outside of the traditional roles and responsibilities of our role. So it's, again, a different way of thinking outside the box. and really looking at how we can really start to match our clinical resources to the patient demand. And finally, this is another way of looking at that ANA model instead of a linear line. It really shows you how things are intertwined and they work together. So, you know, our customer informs the interdisciplinary team, influences the work environment, which influences the practice environment. And then, of course, evaluation just churns the whole thing around and informs the whole picture. So in the ANA guide, it says the first clinical steps that you should do, or critical steps that you should do, is first, you need to design a collaborative, multidisciplinary shared governance for staffing. And this is our springboard here. So the goal is to bring key stakeholders together for ongoing dialogue to develop strategies that invest in staffing to deliver balanced outcomes. So how are we assessing intensity? What are our resources? What's in our control? What's not in our control? And what are those outcomes? Policy and process standardization. When staffing policies and practices are standardized across an organization, matching healthcare workers with patient care is a lot easier, and valuable staffing resources are optimized. So we're doing this a little bit already with our 2 inpatient units. So we're not looking at each inpatient unit as a silo. If the census happens to be higher in one unit rather than the other, the resources will flow to where the patients are. So that's kind of what this is about. So making everything standardized, empowering people and giving them the competency to be able to do that and work in both of those places allows that resource to be easier optimized for patient care. And then the third is technology optimization. And we are moving to a new EMR. So this is very exciting and perfect timing again. But this is about smart technology to strategically move from opinion-based, number-driven staffing to data and research-driven staffing. So this is what, there's always going to be critical thinking. There's always going to be a discretionary interpretation of what we're looking at as far as acuity. But for our EMR to help inform us of what we're looking at maybe even when an admission comes based on a diagnosis and a symptom management or what medications they were on, the ability for a system to analyze those things over time and inform us is critical. So for our brainstorming activity, I ask you these 3 questions. And for those of you who were not here at the, in the webinar or in the Zoom meeting, I encourage you to answer these questions, think about them, and then send your answers to me by email. So what factors need to be considered when making daily staffing decisions? Second, what factors are within our control that affect acuity, resources, and outcomes? And finally, what can we do today, tomorrow, and this year to affect staffing and acuity? So I can't wait to hear your answers. Think about this, and then we'll meet again next Thursday. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.